This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Welcome back. It is good to be back. I've had a good little bit of time off. I am back behind the mic. Mike T is back on the editor's chair, and so all is well with the world. I hope all is well with you also in this time of the Delta variant. Please be safe, wear a mask, get vaccinated. This is no joke. I hope for you all who are returning to school or university that this is an exciting new venture for you. I want to thank my latest rater and reviewer on the Apple Podcast Store. Thank you to Z Griff for the review. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store or podchaser.com and subscribe wherever you are listening. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. My guest today is Sara. And yes, we have had a disproportionate number of people named Sara on the show. But this is an amazing Sara. I am very excited for you to hear her story. Sara has run the gamut of religious traditions. Her parents experienced a dramatic conversion. She began her Christianity in the Assemblies of God church. She then went to a Southern Baptist church. She was later in life a part of the Acts 29 types of churches, more Reformed theology, and then finally Presbyterian churches. Sara is a gifted musician and singer, and that was a major part of her Christian experience. The ability to lead people in worship was deeply meaningful. But she had real doubts, and those doubts were not satisfied by the pat answers that she received. She began to question her faith. Sara uses the analogy of the pool of faith several times. If you want to hear more about that, you can listen to the episode with Captain Cassidy where she describes that in detail. And at the end, Sara asks me some questions about secular humanism, so we get into that as well. I want to note here, and you'll hear at the beginning of this interview as well, that Sara is also a gifted writer. Her blog is called formerprotagonist.blogspot.com. The links will be in the show notes. I highly recommend that you check that out. Here is my conversation with Sara. Sara, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be on after listening for so long.
That is awesome. That is one of the fun things about the podcast is many of the guests wind up being, fans of the show. So thank you for reaching out to me. And I want to just right off the bat highlight your blog, formerprotagonist.blogspot.com. Incredibly well written. I often tell my guests, or just in general, the listeners, that writing out the process of deconstruction and deconversion can be really cathartic. And I think people just reading yours is going to be cathartic.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I just wrote that as just an outlet, like you said, to organize my thoughts and get my feelings out there. And so thanks. It's really encouraging to hear you say that.
Yes. Awesome. So we will definitely have the links in the show note for that. Let's get into it. So let me know what was your faith tradition growing up and what was that like?
Yeah. So, my faith journey, I think like many people, starts with my parents. They both grew up Catholic to varying degrees of devotion. And so by the time they were young adults, I think both of them were very disaffected with religion. Neither of them really wanted anything to do with organized religion. They met, they got married. And then when we were young, my mom was quote unquote saved. She, I think, met someone through like a jazzercise class or something. And that woman apparently just like bubbled over with joy. And she was like, I want that thing. It's kind of like what every Christian wants to hear is like, how,
yes.
She's like, I want that. So she started going to a Bible study. She got saved, got my dad going. And so they really had the life turnaround experience. So
Right.
Before they were saved, they were struggling financially. I think their marriage was struggling, didn't have a lot of sense of, community or purpose. And then after they got saved, their finances turned around, their lives turned around. And so for me, growing up in the church, it wasn't like, we go to church because that's what we do. It was, Jesus saved us and we love him. You know, it was
Right.
our whole lives, and very genuine. So I grew up in an Assemblies of God church. That was and so that's like a pretty charismatic denomination.
It's my background, so yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So, my parents are both musical, as we'll talk about later. My whole family is, I am too. But my dad would sing in the choir and the big productions, like at Christmas, they would always do these big productions. And then my mom is a dancer. She would do the dance ministry with, the flags and flow
Yeah.
skirts and all that. She
Yeah.
still does that. Speaking in tongues, people getting slain in the spirit. I have memories from when I was very young of seeing people get slain in the spirit, and then the deacons would bring out these blankets to cover them up, I guess, to keep them warm. I don't know.
Yes.
But I remember being a child. I mean, it's just God is real. Like this is
Sure.
my life. I do have a vivid memory of being at a kids camp and kids around me like speaking in tongues and getting slain in the spirit. And I was asking for it to happen, but it wasn't happening. And so I just kind of pretended because, you're 8 or 9, like, what are you going to do? But it didn't occur to me. I just thought that I was doing something wrong. So I was like, all right, well, I'll just fall over. So that was my earliest experience. And then in my teen years, we moved and we went to a new church. And my parents, I think, chose this church because it had a thriving kids and teen ministry. So we started going to the Southern Baptist Church. So it was a bit of a change. I remember my mom, the first Sunday that we went, my mom brought her tambourine and she never brought it again.
Yeah.
It was like the looks that we got. So they learned pretty quickly. And I think, honestly, I don't think they were ever totally at home there because it wasn't the same type of experience, but they really did pick it, I think, because of what it offered us.
Right.
And so it was Southern Baptist in like the cool Southern Baptist kind of way, like trying to, like Andy Stanley, like, contemporary music, and the pastor might wear jeans and they do like thematic sermons and that type of thing.
Right.
So I grew up in very much like the youth group heyday culture. So weekly youth group, Sunday school, Bible studies, like church camp, weekend retreats. I mean, it was just my whole life. And that's where what I describe in my blog a little bit, where the name of that blog came from. I wouldn't call it fundamentalist Christianity, although at the end of the day, that's what it is, right? You're going to hell if you don't agree with us. So, but I would call it protagonist Christianity. And what I mean by that is they don't try to convince you by scaring you and saying like, you're going to go to hell. They try to convince you by being like, why wouldn't you want to live this way? Like,
right.
Why wouldn't you want Jesus? Why, like, this is clearly the best way. And it wasn't the prosperity gospel. Like, it was very clear. God might not make you rich. Like, you might suffer. Jesus suffered. But it was like, if you want the deepest relationships, if you want the best life that's rich, full of purpose and joy. And so in my mind, we were the protagonists, right? We're the ones that have figured out the secret of life.
Yeah.
And then people outside of that were very 2D kind of characters. So I was in very much a bubble. So it's like they were either to be pitied and evangelized to, like non-Christians, or they were like crossed over into villain territory if they were pushing against, right? So that's kind of the two categories that people fell into.
So sometimes when parents have that really dramatic salvation experience, and then the kids are following along and maybe don't experience that as much. Was it very real to you personally as a kid?
I think so, because it didn't occur to me that it might not be real.
Right.
And I was surrounded by it, like everyone being so sure. And then my older brother was really into apologetics. So I'd read all the apologetics books that were laying around. And so it was also like, not only is this like real, but we can argue for it the best, which now I know absolutely not to be true. But at the time it's like, I don't know. It's like the voice in my head that I was talking to, which I now look back on as myself, like my imagination. Right. But that was God. And if something good happened, well, that was God. And,
I know exactly what you mean. And I think the listeners know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was a very young age when I like walked up the aisle, and I was very genuine. It was very real to me. And I pretty much rededicated my life like every summer at summer camp,
Right.
So But yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. It just was always real. The sky is blue and God is real, you know?
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So in middle and high school, I was, quintessential youth group kid. I sang in the worship team. So we had band practice every week and I loved it. And it was so great. I was so confident in my faith. And then I went to college, and it's like every Christian parent's nightmare. I went to a large public liberal university. And actually, even at university, I got plugged in right away to Christian community. So a student campus organization, literally the people I lived with. I mean, it was just a continuation, like large group every week, small groups, outreach events, like community, just plugged right in. And it was wonderful. I loved it. I had a great time. And it was during college, though, that I first had doubts. I think it's unavoidable, right? You go and you are introduced to people from other perspectives and other points of view. And it's like, whoa, the world is bigger than I thought it was.
Right.
Two experiences in particular, I remember even from the first year of college. One was that I got involved with a pretty charismatic church that was near campus. I kind of started going to some of their stuff. And it was in the tradition of IHOP, which stands for International House of Prayer, not pancakes. Yeah. And they would do like 24-hour worship nights and prayer stuff. And they would go out and try to like pray healing on people. And it was similar to when I was a little girl. It just didn't happen for me. People around me are like feeling the Holy Spirit. And I'm just kind of like, all right. Or like I never saw anyone actually get healed. Maybe someone was like, oh, my leg used to be an inch shorter and now it's not, But
yeah, there was all kinds of those kinds of fake healings.
Right. And even at that point, I was like, what? It's not really,
that doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So that experience, I think, threw me a little bit because it was so experiential and I didn't experience it. So I was a little bit like, what's going on? And then the other thing that happened freshman year was I took an Intro to Old Testament course, and the teacher was really respectful of the Bible. She did a great job. I still don't know what her faith was. She did a great job of not revealing that, which I think was really smart. But she taught it as literature. And so that was the first time that I heard that there were two accounts of creation in Genesis. And I was mortified that I didn't know that. I mean, I've been studying the Bible my whole life, I thought.
Right.
And I didn't realize that there are two accounts of creation that they contradict each other. And her explanation made total sense, that there are different strands, blah, blah, blah. But at the time, I just felt so blindsided. And then the other thing, and this is such a small thing, but I remember just feeling so betrayed. She was talking about the Old Testament books like Joshua and Judges, and how they would say, oh, Joshua killed 10,000 men, or David killed 15,000 men. And she said, well, that doesn't mean that they literally exactly killed 15,000 men and not one more, one less. That's just a literary device that writers in this time would use to describe someone's might, to describe how amazing they were in battle. They would just use these figures of speech. And for some reason, I was like, what? I looked
metaphor,
now,
really?
Yeah, metaphor in the Bible. And it's so silly. And of course, for plenty of people who are Christians, it's like, well, duh, there's metaphor. But for some reason, it just completely shocked me. So that felt like a big hit. So I recovered from those blows, but those were kind of the first times I think that I was like, God, are you real? Is this? I had some internal struggle. It was all internal. Externally, I was leading the worship team for the youth, the campus ministry. I was leading a small group. I was on the coordinating leadership team. I mean, I was all in. But as college went on, I started to have more and more of these little blows.
Right.
The campus organization that I was a part of was really heavily focused on outreach, like international outreach, reaching unreached people groups. So we would talk about that all the time, unreached people groups. That kind of backfired for me because I was like, well, wait, there are people who are apparently dying and going to hell simply because no one has reached them with the gospel. That doesn't seem fair. That doesn't seem just. And the answers you get are not satisfactory for that. It's either, oh, well, God reaches them in a way like through nature, like it says something in the Bible about it. And I'm like, okay, so then why do we have to do missions if that's true? And then the other answer is the more like Calvinist one, which is like, well, any of us are lucky to go to heaven at all. We should all be going to hell, Right. And it's like, well, how convenient for you that you are the one who doesn't have to go to hell.
Exactly. And some of the Arminian point of view seems to be the worst thing you could do is tell someone the gospel, because then that makes them responsible.
Right. Then they could choose to go against it. Yeah. So that was really confusing to me. And then the other big issue, which again, I think is very common, is just my increasing awareness of LGBTQ people as real people. Yes. So in that protagonist mindset, again, I think that's how a lot of Christians can function not being gay affirming and not thinking of themselves as bigoted, because it's not real full three-dimensional people. It's a community, the gay community,
It's
the
a
gay agenda,
lifestyle.
it's a
Yeah.
lifestyle. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's easy to think that when they are 2D characters, two-dimensional characters in your mind. But
Yeah.
I was a music major. So a lot of my friends were gay or queer, something outside of heteronormative. And I was having more and more to deal with that. And I had several friends in my ministry who I was walking with through their own struggles of trying not to be gay. I'm watching them just metaphorically bang their heads against a wall, trying not to experience attraction, these very normal feelings.
Right.
And so watching that happen and just seeing the fruit come from that, which wasn't good. It was, shame and depression and anxiety and just struggle.
It's devastating.
Yes. And so more and more I was like, well, wait a second. And it's interesting because, again, a lot of people go through this, and the answer is to and I did go through phases of this, go more towards progressive Christianity or whatever. But for some reason, it's I would always come back and be like, well, is God even real? Is any of this even real? Because if I'm believing these hard things, that this person across the world is going to hell because of where they were born, or that my friend can't find love the way that I can because of, then I need to know that this is real. And I would just beg God in my journals. I mean, I have journals from that time. I look back and it's just devastating over and over again. Please show yourself to me. I want to believe. I want to know that you're real. I'm quoting scripture I believe, help my unbelief, or what the disciples said, where else can I go but you? I mean, I was just pouring it out and nothing. I mean, eventually my little pool of faith would be filled because I'd have a great worship experience, or I'd have a great small group time, and I'm surrounded by it, and it's my whole life, but never God never responded. I was always show me you're real, show me you're real, show me you're real. And not in a, I'm testing you way, in an agonized, I'm trying to believe in you, help me out here. I mean,
Desperation. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm laying it all out here for you, please. So all throughout college, it was externally, I'm just all in. And even internally, I'm trying to be all in. I genuinely believed as hard as I could, but I had these doubts. And I remember describing it to a friend at the time as if my faith was a big stone statue, and it felt very firm and solid, but somewhere, some little person with a chisel was just tap, 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 tapping away. And I was so petrified that one day it was just going to crack, it was going to shatter. And that's how it felt, all these questions that I had.
The word brittle comes to mind. That makes sense to me a lot. That really resonates with me. At some point, that faith that felt literally rock solid for so long suddenly feels really brittle and vulnerable.
Yes. And I remember, again, I was a leader in this campus organization, so I was able to set some of the tone of what we talked about. And I encouraged people, hey, let's just talk about our doubts. Let's be open. If God can handle it, let's to be like Job. Let's question God. Let's be honest. Let's be vulnerable. And then people would be like, I really doubt that God is good. Or I really doubt that God has a plan for my life, and I was like, oh, well, I doubt that he's real, but I guess I'm the only one. It was everyone else's doubts were I doubt that he's in control.
Yeah,
yes. It's I doubt that this fishbowl is actually real life. It felt like I was the only one, which I know in retrospect I wasn't.
What's important about that is that, Christians talk about doubt. The good versions of Christianity will allow for doubt, but that is still bounded. There's a certain type of doubt. You're allowed to doubt for a certain amount of time.
Yep.
And if you don't accept the answers that you're given, then you start to feel that weight. So a real question of, is God real, is not something you felt comfortable voicing because you knew you would get a negative response.
Right. And then to some extent, it's oh, well, now you're trying to test God.
Right.
And then you go down that whole path. And yeah, I think I wanted so desperately for it to be real. And on my good days, I did believe that it was real. I would point to good things that happened in my life and be like, look, God is orchestrating things. He's, but it's funny looking back, I still have never read any significant atheist literature because at the time I was afraid. I remember going to a friend's house for his birthday party, and this friend I had through school, and he was an outspoken atheist. And I remember seeing on his shelves some books, maybe a Richard Dawkins book or something. And I had a physical panic response. I was so afraid of those books. I was afraid that I would read them and agree, that I would read them and I wouldn't be able to come back from it. It was the forbidden fruit. I was so afraid, Pandora's box, So I still actually have to this day, I've never read them now because I'm just not really that interested. But it's just funny looking back. I was so afraid because I kind of knew I was holding on by
Right.
thread.
Yeah. I think that is also really common. Like, it may not be
Yeah.
specifically atheist books, but somehow I know that I was aware that there were questions I
Hmm.
shouldn't ask.
Yeah.
And that if I really went and looked for the answers, that was going to be bad. And,
Yeah.
and somehow I was able to shove that back into a corner and ignore it for years.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's such a red flag, right? Like if there are
Yeah.
questions you can't ask, that's a sign. So I graduated from college. I married my boyfriend, pretty soon after we graduated.
Okay.
And at this point, I had gravitated towards, we were going to a church that was part of the Acts 29 network, which is Reformed theology. So like John Piper, I'm sure there's other big names in that. And I think I had gravitated towards them because of my doubts, because I had had sort of a negative experience with the experiential, charismatic, like emotion driven. I was like, oh man, well, I can't trust that because I don't know if it's real. And what they offered was so inviting because it was so sure of itself, right? They're
Right.
very sure of themselves. And it was so based on theology and on the Bible. It was like, we aren't going to do just some silly sermon series. We are going through the book of John and we're going to go verse by verse and we're digging into what the words mean and we're digging into theology. And it's not a show. The music was in this particular church. I mean, the music was all quirky and folksy, and everyone had tattoos. And, it was the type of church that would have like a hymn sing at a brewery, it's really
Right.
cool. And
The hipster
oh,
church.
yes.
Yeah.
The city I live in, there's a good population of people like that. Although now we're all getting to the point where we have like yards and kids, so not
Yes,
really
exactly.
hipsters anymore. But that's the
It
vibe.
happens. Yeah.
That was the vibe. We were cool once. So I was like, okay, I need to dig into it's all about Jesus. It's about the gospel. It's about the Bible. I need to just dig into this. And this is what I need to base my faith on. Right. So someone hearing my story might be like, oh, well, your faith was brittle because you had it on the wrong things. You were basing it on your emotions or your emotional experience of God, or you were basing it on like your tradition, blah, blah, blah. Well, I thought the same way. So I was like, okay, I'm going to base my faith on the Bible, on theology, on knowing God, And so this was the community that we were in. It was great. My husband thought he might want to go into youth ministry. And so he got a job at a church in our same town as the assistant to youth director. It was a really great gig. It was a 2-year thing. And the idea was, hey, let's try this out. If it ends up being a good fit, maybe you can stay on,
Mm-hmm.
And so we started going to this church. It was a PCA church. So again, Presbyterian, Reformed. And it was such an interesting experience for me coming from more of a charismatic and then Southern Baptist background, because these were the people that I had thought were not real Christians because they read their prayers out loud together with prepared words, right? It's like they can't even make up their own prayers. And then I come to this church and come to find out they think the charismatic people aren't real Christians because they're basing their faith on emotion.
Right, exactly. You have really run the gamut there, from Assemblies of God to Southern Baptist to Acts kinds of churches to kind of mainline. That's an amazing array of experiences. So.
Yeah, well, and I don't think they would call themselves mainline, but
right.
But yes, you're absolutely right. And we can talk about this a little bit later when we talk about the music thing. But having sung at all of these churches and led worship at all of these types of churches, I've not only been a part of them, I've been behind the curtain and been part of like making decisions about how these services will go and that type of thing. So it's been really interesting to be a part of it in that way, which both prolonged my faith and also kind of helped kill it, because again, you're seeing all of the infighting and the like, well, they aren't real Christians because of this, and So my husband and I started going to this church. He was on staff and I threw myself into serving. We had a great small group. It was a wonderful experience. People talk about, people who are leaving the church because they're hurt. I loved it. I was like the poster child for church. Yeah. I mean, I'm a white heterosexual cis woman who has leadership skills, but also is okay with kind of being put in the corner because I'm not a man. I fit in great. That was definitely not why I left, because I could still be blissfully. I mean, again, I'm a married woman with 2 kids. Like I fit right into all their algorithms.
Yes.
But yeah, at the time we had great community. It was wonderful. But still my doubts would crop up, like a rash, like a disease that I was trying to, I was in remission most of the time and then it would pop up. mostly around the treatment of LGBTQ people, mostly around the issue of salvation and who goes to hell. This was a Calvinist type of environment. So I wasn't sure how, I kind of didn't think about it too much because I was like, that's dumb. But when it would pop up, again, it was just so threatening to my life because this was my entire life. And I saw families in this church. We didn't have kids yet, but I saw families with young kids and how they were surrounded by community, and they just seemed so happy and put together. And I was like, this is what I want my life to be. And so I thought that I might not be there. I mean, it was just devastating. There's one moment in particular I remember, and I wrote about this in my blog. My husband and I were lying in bed one night, and I was having an outbreak, of doubts.
Yes.
And I asked him, I said, what happens if you become a pastor and I can't be a Christian anymore? And at the time, this was like me voicing my deepest, darkest fear, because I was like, that's preposterous. This would never happen. But what would you do? And he just hugged me and he said, I would quit. I'd get a new job.
Good man.
Yeah. Just the comfort I remember feeling, just the exhale of relief of like, even if I lost everything, which at the time, losing my faith felt like I would lose everything, I wasn't going to lose him. And that was just incredible. So we were at this church, the 2 years go by. It didn't seem like a good fit, youth ministry, which thank goodness. I'll look back on that. I'm like so thankful that didn't work out.
Yeah.
Because now he's in like software development and, just the night and day.
Yeah.
But we came to a natural opportunity to move because his job was ending and I was in a professional place where it made sense for me to go to graduate school. And so we moved a little further down south into more of the Bible Belt for me to go to grad school. And so, the first thing after finding a place to live was finding a church. We were like, we're going to get plugged in, community, here we go. And we found a church. It was kind of against my better judgment. We chose this church because it was like non-denominational, but Southern Baptist,
Sure.
like very, so we're talking cool, like dark lights. It was like walking into a Hollister. I mean, just, big dark room, cool lights. All of the band is dressed immaculately and they have in-ear things. And like the pastor is somehow deep, but also tweetable. Like they're trying to grow their church. It's all about evangelism. It's all about getting involved. But it was full of young people our age and we really wanted friends. So I was like, okay, this, I can get down with this. So we join a small group, we start serving, we do all the stuff. And at that time, I think so I've heard other people on your podcast talk about the pool of faith, right? And you might have holes being poked in it, but you got enough pouring into it that you don't have to face them.
Exactly.
My pool was definitely drying up. So we'd moved away from our community. We were going to this church now where I really did not feel like I fit in at all. So where I live now and we've moved back since, but like, so the town where I went to college, it's a mid-sized city. So I know Christians of all political persuasions. Like I know Christians on pretty much all the spectrum of like both progressive and conservative religiously and politically. It's not unusual to have people who disagree about things. But moving into this new town that was very much more in the Bible Belt, I mean, it was my first experience of like, whoa, everyone here is a conservative Christian, like white Southern,
It's a monoculture.
Yes. So this was the fall of 2016. When Trump was elected.
Okay.
And there were just a few moments I remember just sitting back and being like, wow. So one example, we were in a small group and a woman in our small group who was a teacher, an elementary school teacher, was asking for prayer because one of her kids in her class had two moms and they had requested that she add some literature to the class library that included queer families, that included families that, and this woman in my small group was like, I just feel like I'm betraying my faith, like kind of doing the whole persecution thing.
Yeah.
And I was saying, I'm like the only one in the room that was like, well, do you see why they might want their daughter to see families that look like hers? Like, do you see why that it was like no one else. And the other moment I remember.
In a public school.
In a public school, yeah. And then the other thing I remember was after Trump was elected, it came out that Mike Pence like followed the Billy Graham rule. Mm-hmm. And for people unfamiliar with that, Billy Graham was a televangelist who famously would not be alone with a woman who was not his wife. And so it came out that Pence follows this rule, I guess. And he was getting a lot of flack for it in the media.
Right.
And everyone in my small group was like, oh, he's sticking up for Christian values and family values and always being persecuted. And again, I was the only one who was like, well, do you see how this could disadvantage women who work with him? Like,
Yes.
Do you see how this could make it hard for women to do their jobs if every man followed this rule? I'm in grad school. I'm just coming from having lunch with like one of the other grad students who's a man who I have to work with. I'm like,
Right.
do you see how this might be? And yeah, again, there's room enough in the Christian faith for people to have all these different perspectives. And it's not like that's what drove me away, but it was enough for me to then have to start to deal with what was going on underneath. It's like I said, the things that had been pouring into my pool of faith to keep me there were drying up. And more and more, I was like, I don't identify with this group of people at all.
I talk about this as kind of critical mass of questions. So any one question or doubt that you have is generally manageable, and you can either ignore it or rationalize it or what have you. But as they start to pile up, and we often focus on the last one, the straw that broke the camel's back, but really it's these hundreds of things. And it sounds like, you were just starting to be conscious of several of these all at the same time.
Like allowing myself to acknowledge them. And again, it's like at any time, God could have balanced the scales by weighing in and reassuring me, and then people might say, well, what were you hoping for? Well, I don't know, but something.
Right. Yeah.
Something
that was very low. Very low.
Yes. Yeah. Something that wasn't just my emotions, and again, I'm a trained musician. I know what the songs are doing to me. I know what is emotion and what is, it's not the Holy Spirit. It's a key change. I know that.
Right.
And so I'm just, again, praying, crying out, asking God. Throughout that time, I finally let myself start to even just read like some progressive Christian literature. So like Rachel Held Evans, loved her work. I wish she hadn't passed away so young, because she's just, everything she put out was wonderful. And I had always been told she was like terrifying, like scary, it was Rachel the heretic, Rachel Held Evans. And so when I read her work, I was like, wow, it's so gracious and well reasoned. And she and I landed in different places, right? She kept her faith. She continued to believe, and I did not, but still her work was so helpful for me in just realizing I wasn't the only one asking these questions. I wasn't the only one who was questioning a lot of these things that specifically my brand of Christianity had taught me. So I finally kind of let myself do that.
I was just going to say, I think that Rachel Held Evans is a good bridge. It's just because it's like you mentioned earlier, no way would you read an atheist book because that's way too dangerous. But if you read Rachel, she's speaking that Christianese. She's, she's not trying to throw everything away. She's just asking similar questions that you might be asking as well.
Yeah.
So even as I'm a materialist atheist, I think Rachel Held Evans is a really important voice out there.
And I think that's why so many Christians are so scared of her, Christians in leadership, because she is kind of a bridge. But again, I ask you, if someone who is asking these questions in good faith with obvious love for the faith and for Jesus, and you read her books, it's clear that she loves her faith and that she was very respectful. If that is dangerous, you got to ask yourself why.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
But yeah, so I finally let myself kind of go down that path. But I think, so I finished my graduate degree and we moved right back to our town, our college town. We were like, do not let the dust, just shake the dust off our feet. As soon as I graduated, literally the day of my graduation ceremony, we moved back because we were done with living there. And then about 22 days later, I gave birth to our first child. So big life shift. Thank you. Yeah. It was, And I'll tell you that an interesting, talking about big moments in my faith or deconversion journey, I had heard so many other friends who had had babies talk about, I couldn't have gotten through that birth of my child without Jesus. Like, prayer got me through it. I needed the strength of Jesus. It brought me to the end of myself. And I could have only done that because of Jesus. And so I was kind of thinking maybe I'll have that same experience. And wow, that's going to be like God's going to show himself to me. I didn't think about God once.
Yes.
Not once. I didn't pray. Yeah. Nothing. And that was the hardest thing up until this point I'd ever done in my life. And I looked back and I was like, I didn't even think about God. It didn't even occur to me. So that was interesting, just philosophically to think about. I was like, okay, what does that mean?
That's also a really interesting thing, is that even if you are trying to be faithful, but you have these moments of recognition of, wow, I've just gone through the last week without really thinking about God.
Mm-hmm.
I've just, I've been living my life and really God hasn't been a part of it. And you have this sudden recognition of, wow, that may be a bad thing.
Yeah,
Like,
it's a weird feeling. Like, when was the last time I prayed? When was
right.
the last time I read the Bible? Like, it's a very, that is definitely an important moment when you kind of realize, whoa, I and my life has continued on pretty
Yes,
much the
nothing
same.
dramatic has happened. Nothing
Yeah.
terrible. Yeah.
We had our son, and that kind of gives you an excuse not to go to church for a while, right? Because you have a newborn, and we had just moved back, so we were kind of hemming and hawing of like trying to find a new church. And at this point, I don't think I had admitted that I'd lost my faith, but I was like, I need a break from church for a while,
Yeah.
and we need a break. So we tried out a few churches half-heartedly, but as people have said on here before, once you see through it, it's hard to go back. I mean,
Yeah.
and they all kind of felt the same, and so it just sort of faded. I think my reasons for hanging on sort of faded, and more my questions just kind of piled up. And like you said, I was just living my life at this point. I was figuring out being a mom, going through postpartum depression, which was the first time in my life I'd
Mm.
had to deal with anything like that. So I was, figuring that out, figuring out who I was, and then simultaneously kind of realizing that I was post faith, like realizing, wait, I don't think I believe in this anymore. And I think the final straw, if you want to call it that,
Hmm.
was becoming a mother. You know, again, watching other people have kids, they would say, "Oh, their sin nature is coming out," like in toddlerhood, like, "Oh, it's crazy how soon you see that sin nature come out. Their selfishness from the beginning, blah blah blah." And then I have my own, and I'm watching him become a toddler, and I was like, that's just developmental. He's a human.
Right.
He's imperfect. Yes, I'm imperfect. There are days when I just want to scream, but I can understand from a developmental point of view why he's doing everything he's doing. It's not because he's sinful. It's because he is egocentric, and that's developmentally appropriate because his little brain doesn't know to have empathy yet.
Yeah.
And I think I got to the point of up until this point, I didn't like the idea of hell. As I said, that's something I'd struggled with for a long time. But looking at him, I was like, there's no way. Like, people always said, "Oh, when you become a parent, you will understand the love of God as a parent. Like, you'll understand how rich the love of God is as a father, blah, blah, blah."
Mm.
And so I think I was like, oh yeah, maybe when I become a parent, then my faith will really be strengthened. It was the opposite. I looked at my son, and I thought to myself, if all that stood in between him being tortured for eternity and myself and not being tortured, or even just us, if all that stood in between us being in a relationship for eternity was
Right.
him knowing that I'm real and knowing that I love him, there's not a thing I wouldn't do. There is not a
Mm.
sense that I would not use to show myself to him. He would be experiencing me through his sight, his smell, his taste, his touch, his intuition, everything. I would be walking and talking with him every single day. I would be like, there's not a thing I wouldn't do. And I wouldn't create such a rigged system in the first place.
And you literally did that, I imagine, right?
Right.
Like I had one guest on that was talking about growing up and not really having a lot of affection as a kid, and then becoming a mother, and she was able to give that to her daughter. And so, I think that is very true as a parent. I remember feeling all of those things of just, I'm going to hold this little tiny precious thing as tight as I possibly can and never let
Right.
go. And like, so you're identifying something so important when you do experience parenthood, if you choose to do that. You find that you would do absolutely anything to express how much you love that child and to make sure
Yeah.
that they understand that you love them that much. And
Right.
and then to compare and contrast that to the deafening silence of the purported relationship with God.
Yeah. And people say, well, he didn't withhold anything. He gave his only son. And I'm like, okay, so 2,000 years ago, a man had a bad weekend. I mean, died. That's terrible, I'm sure. Humans have suffered far worse, in my opinion. And then rose again. And that was it? That was the best? Couldn't you at least arrange for that to happen every 150 years so every generation can know that it's real? I mean,
Right.
surely there must be something. And then, okay, supposedly God loves each and every human on earth who's ever existed the way I love my son. And yet, he hardened Pharaoh's heart and allowed all the firstborn children of Egypt to be slaughtered. Were they not his children? I mean, if you look at the Bible, to me, it's clear that humans are disposable to God, as described in the Bible. So does some of us are his children and others aren't? And I know that people have answers to this, but I have not found any that were satisfactory. And yeah, again, it just comes down to, I look at my son and I'm like, there's no way. When I think about how I cried out to God for years, with an honest, hey, this is what I'm struggling with. I'm struggling to believe that you're real. I want to believe. Please help me. And nothing. That's not how I would treat my son, especially if eternity was on the line. So I kind of just came to that conclusion that I was like, man, not only is this little human, he's not perfect, but he's a little human. He's not some sinful beast. He's a human. And that's not how I would treat him, if I was God. So I think that for me was just the thing that made me be like, nope, I can't do it. And so I finally let myself just admit, okay, I don't believe in this anymore.
That is my favorite way to describe this. We often use the term loss of faith. And my good friend mentioned, loss in the sense of grief makes sense, but the sense of, I walked away or I chose to leave is not as true as I admitted to myself I no longer believe. And I really think that is a key step, because that's really what it is.
Yeah.
It's I'm not going to pretend to myself any longer.
Yeah. And that is so true, because I desperately wanted to believe. And there are parts of Christianity that I would gladly be a part of, progressive denominations of Christianity, forms of Christianity that haven't been touched by white nationalism and all the things that I grew up with. There's so much good out there being done in these forms, and I would gladly be a part of it if I believed that it was about something real, but I just don't. And I can't make myself, I'm open to I call myself like an agnostic, like a functional atheist. I'm totally open to God proving me wrong.
Right.
Or some other deity. I haven't really explored other religions to this point, because I just haven't, after being like God's defense lawyer for your whole life and defending your beliefs all the time. It's just kind of exhausting. It's been nice just not to have to worry about that. But I would love to explore that someday. And I'm happy when other people have it. I just can't make myself believe something that I don't.
You mentioned community in a number of contexts there, and that was one of the things you were fearing losing the most. I feel like that is such a human need, and part of what I think keeps people in the faith is the recognition that they need a community, and that admitting that they no longer believe would lose that community.
Yeah.
Have you been able to rebuild that in some way or another?
Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely a big thing that I hear from a lot of the people I've connected to online. Basically, that's about who have left their faith, is that loneliness. And actually, one of the things I really had to work through once I finally admitted that I was no longer a Christian, I had this horrible fear that all of my relationships were going to go to shit. Right. I've been raised being told either implicitly or explicitly that if your marriage is built on God, it's going to last. If your friendships are built around the gospel, they are really true and deep, and everything else is shallow, So my logical conclusion was that when I no longer had the gospel, my marriage was going to crumble, and my friends I wouldn't have this gospel-centered advice to give them anymore. We wouldn't have that deep thing connecting us. I would be like pushed to the periphery of their lives. These were all my fears. And I'm really happy to report that that's not true. My marriage is better than ever. And I didn't say this, but I should. My husband kind of deconverted along with me. We were very fortunate. Okay. So I was the one with the questions initially, but our values very much remained in sync. And as I was questioning, he was like, yeah, you're right. That's messed up, And so we both kind of had a similar trajectory, and we're very much on the same page. So that was really helpful. I found that some of my really close friendships I've been able to maintain because they're based on more than just our faith. And so they're able to respect me and what I believe, and I'm able to respect them. And we,
right.
But yeah, the loss of community in the terms of like a place, you can go every week and you're going to see people socially, like a group of people. I mourned that a little bit when we had our second child this past year in 2020. Our meal train was a lot shorter. than it would have been if I was still in a church, right?
Right.
It's like that built-in pool of people to help you move, people to bring food when you've got a baby, and I've definitely mourned that. I think, as you've talked about on here, like that's one thing Christianity does do really well, and I think like is that community, is that kind of captive. And there have actually been times where I've felt resentful of churches for claiming people's time so much. So, for example, like a close friend of mine, or like one of my siblings, it's like they're so busy because they're doing all this stuff with their church and in their church community. And sometimes I'm like, come on, I'm your sibling. Like, why aren't you, I've like thought that. But I think my husband and I don't know, we've kind of built community in other ways. Now, granted, we're in a stage of life. We have 2 very young kids. We're tired. Sure. So our social calendar, regardless, is not that full.
Yeah.
But we found it in other ways. This is very nerdy, but we play D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. And we have so much fun with that. And it's kind of brought back that feeling of having a regular social gathering,
That's awesome.
It's so fun. It's so creative. I highly recommend to anybody if you're looking for a fun, creative hobby. And it's like, okay, every 2 weeks, we've got this group of people we get together with, and we eat together and we have fun and we play this thing. And it feels like that feeling of having a small group where you're, as they like to say, doing life together,
I think that, again, really, really important. It doesn't have to be a group about not believing in God.
Right. Yes.
If you like knitting, if you like cycling, if you like D&D, Magic the Gathering, whatever it is, do something with a group of people, and you're going to experience. And what you'll notice is that you have like you say, very similar feelings towards those people that you may have had when you were in church in a small group.
Yeah. And I was always told that kind of thing was a waste of time. Your life is supposed to be about spreading the gospel, about growing closer to Christ, and like doing that stuff. Like, you could be doing so much more for the kingdom. That's a waste of time. But it's not. And it's not shallow and dumb. I mean, you can have deep relationships with people, like you said, that aren't based around your belief or your lack thereof. I have a book club with some friends who they're all Christians actually, but they're pretty progressive. And so we're able to, we have similar values. And so we have a great time together. Like those types of relationships, it's just been cool to see that they are still meaningful and real. And I think I've also had to be okay with my inner circle, just being a little smaller. I think when you're a part of a church, and I'm a very relational person. And so I really thought I had to be super close with so many people and have so many people in and now I'm realizing it's okay that I have kind of my smaller group of really close friends that I know will be there no matter what. And then I have these friends that I do this thing with, and I have these friends that I do this thing with. And part of that is just life growing up as an adult. You're
adulting is hard. Yes. And you do find who your real friends are. So you talked about having, you can respect one another, even though you disagree on, your metaphysics. Right. And I felt the same way. The people who actually loved me, it was it was a big deal, but there was never any question that we were going to remain friends. That was always going to be the case. And for anybody who that wasn't the case, it was time for them to go anyway.
Yeah. And I do have some friendships that I think they still do genuinely care for me, and we have positive, we've never had like a falling out, because honestly, most of my friends, I haven't talked about this with. My closest friends know where I stand and know where I am. Most of my acquaintances, I've never said anything on social media. I don't really make a big deal out of it. I'm enjoying for the first time in my life that my religious beliefs are private. I don't have to talk about them.
Right.
And I think there are definitely some friends who it's just sort of drifted, because again, if your time is so caught up in church, your church community, and then you got your family, you don't have much time for stuff outside of that. So there are some friendships that once I stopped being part of that church community, we just kind of fell out of touch. And I'm sure the day will, and then COVID, so.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So I'm sure the day might come where I have a few more of these awkward, like maybe we get together and it's like, so, but yeah, I have found that just those friendships that weren't based around anything else other than faith did just kind of fall by the wayside. And then the ones that were based around other things have just strengthened. And so I've been able to maintain that sense of community, thankfully.
The other thing that I found is some friends who, I have not as much contact with, you discover that they've been on a deconstruction journey. They may they may not be deconverting, but like, they are like, man, I don't understand about the Bible. And then you wind up having all these things that you can talk to them about.
Oh
So
yeah, it's a great feeling when someone like reaches out, or like you kind of like, I don't know, you might like post a meme or something, and then someone's like, "Oh, you too?
yeah,
You too?" Yeah,
exactly.
it's like, "Oh
Exactly.
yeah, you," yeah, and then you
Yeah,
figure it out, and yeah, that's really fun.
yeah, yeah. You've been incredibly honest about doubts and faking it when you knew that
Yeah.
was the thing to do, that kind of thing. But in your blog, you talk about the earnestness.
Mm.
I want to make it clear how dedicated you were, that as a worship leader, that this was truly deeply meaningful to you.
Oh yeah, yeah, and when I talk about, oh, I did this and I did that, and I did that, I'm not trying to say, oh, legalistically, look how great a Christian I was. I'm trying to indicate how strongly I believed this was worthwhile and how much how much God was a part of my life, And I
Right.
remember leading worship. And that was always an interesting exercise as a classically trained musician, leading worship. On one hand, musically, I know what's happening. So we're picking up the dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
The bridge is coming. Oh, people are getting into it. I'm going to repeat the bridge, and we're building, and we're having a
Yeah.
crescendo. But also at the same time, I was able, for most part, to let that part of my brain go and just feel the room and feel people worshiping and that was such an amazing feeling. And I hoped it was the Holy Spirit, even if a part of me kind of maybe knew that
Sure.
it wasn't. But I just remember standing on stage in between songs and just praying, like, Lord, let it be all about you, not about me. Let it be all about you. Like, I want the Holy Spirit to be here. Please, please, and in kind of that way that Christians do, where you just say it over and over and over again, hoping it'll be true.
Yes.
But yeah, it was so earnest, and I just think about people saying, and no one, because I haven't had too many conversations about this with people, no one has said too straight to me, oh, well, you're never a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that's sort of the answer, for especially if you're like a Calvinist.
Definitely for Calvinists. Yes.
And to that I say, well, then no one should feel secure in their salvation.
Yeah.
You should be worried, because if I wasn't, then who can say that they truly are? And maybe they'll say, well, you're going through a phase, like you'll come back. And so that's it. Cool. I'm waiting. Like, God,
Yeah.
show yourself to me. But I believed
Yeah.
it. All the people who allowed me to be in leadership at their churches believed it. And I wasn't trying to trick anybody. I was genuinely seeking God. I was growing in my faith. People saw the evidence of the fruits of the Holy Spirit in my life. I said things that people were like, oh man, God really spoke to me through that. I don't know what else. I don't know what other metrics, I studied the Bible. I don't know what other metrics to use.
Yeah.
I was so
Yeah.
earnest.
I can definitely hear that in what you're saying and
Yeah.
read that in your blog posts. And I'd recommend anybody who questions again to read what you have written down, because that just leaps off the page of how dedicated you were.
And it's funny. I remember I don't know if this was near the end, actually. This was probably late college. I was having like a bad week of doubts, a
Mm-hmm.
downturn. And my parents' church invited me to come lead worship. They were doing a special service. And so my sister and I were both musical, went to lead worship. And it was a more charismatic church that they'd gone to at this point. And we, did the worship set. I'm on piano, I'm singing, my sister's doing guitar, And the whole time I'm thinking in my head, I don't know if I believe any of this. I don't know if any of this is real. I
Yeah.
just don't know. I just don't know. Inside my head, as I'm leading worship externally. And afterwards, someone came up to me and they were like, that is the most Holy Spirit filled worship I have experienced in a long time. Like that
Yeah.
is just, wow. And I'm saying there I was just like, well, I just spent 4 years and $60,000 learning how to manipulate you with my voice. So I guess that's what it was. Just moments like that where I was just
Yeah.
so, I don't know, man, that going back and forth was just emotionally exhausting, trying
Yeah.
desperately to believe that it was real, whilst just the whole time kind of being like, I don't know.
I do think it's important to say here, again, you're being incredibly honest, but it's important to say that you are having and helping other people have an experience.
Yeah.
Right? It's a human experience,
Yeah.
and that's okay. But it's that attribution to an external deity that is the part that you can't square that circle. It doesn't work.
Yeah. And that's been so interesting too. Like my whole life, all the things that I do well, I've attributed to God, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my ability to communicate or to give a friend the advice that they might need, or to encourage somebody. It's like, oh, wow, the Holy Spirit is working through you. Like
Right.
Jesus is really working through you. But since I left the faith, I still do those things like that. And it's been a really interesting journey to realize like that's me. And I'm not putting myself on a pedestal. This journey has also been me having to squarely face my own weaknesses and not just try to pray about them, be like, oh, I'm a full human being. And that means there's things I do well and things I don't. And, values that I try to live up to, but I don't always live up to them. And I'm a human.
Right.
But I don't know. It's been almost empowering and freeing to realize like these are part of me. It's not just all coming from a God working through me, you know?
One last topic. You're talking about being on a worship team. They needed my free labor and I needed to be needed. And later you say, I was used to being needed in another church where you didn't feel quite as needed. I think that is another really deeply important human thing. But you want to talk about how that worked for you? Was it a positive or a negative?
Yeah. So being a part of churches and organizations where everything is volunteer my whole life. When I came to college as a music major, and the first time I realized that people got paid to sing at churches, I was aghast. I was like, that is demonic. That's terrible. I was like, you mean you get paid to go sing at a church and you might not even be a Christian? I was just horrified by that. But my whole life, my parents modeled it. They served joyfully and used all of their gifts, and I did it my whole life. And it's so validating. I mean, when I think about my experience in college, I got so much leadership practice. I got to use gifts that I had, and it felt good. It felt great. And I got to use my voice to sing every week, and I got to help, and that was a huge part of my identity. And I think that's part of what kept me in so long, because who am I outside of this? Like, to this day, I don't, this is kind of sad to admit, I don't really sing anymore. I have 2 degrees in music. I used to be a music teacher. Now I work in a different job, which I love, but doesn't involve day-to-day singing. I never cultivated singing outside of like work, like choral or church. And I just don't really ever sing anymore because I don't have an outlet for it. And there's, I'm sure there's like, it's a little triggering almost to sing, I feel like, but church gave me these outlets and it was part of who I was. And so, I think that kept me in a really long time because I couldn't imagine not having that. And it felt so good and it felt so validating and so purposeful. And that was one of the hard things when we moved. The church that we went to that was like cool, hip, fake, or like secretly Southern Baptist, they were so intense about their music that they had a lot of gatekeeping up before you could be a part of it. And such a big church, they had tons of young, talented people. And so really they needed people to like do the parking lot. They didn't need more singers. And so I barely was involved. And that was hard for me, that I had so much anxiety over that because I was clinging to that. Like if I couldn't have that weekly experience where I'm watching the whole room worship and feeling their earnestness and like, okay, yes, this is what I believe. This is real. This is a thing. If I couldn't have that, I started to lose. It was like, oh, all the doubts are coming out now, And so I think serving in that way and it being my identity was part of what kept my pool of faith filled for so long, because it just felt so good to be a part of. And so, that was something I really had to work through when I left.
You mentioned it almost being triggering to sing. I was never a singer. I have a terrible voice, but I enjoyed it. And the few times I've been back to church, that's the one thing I really feel deeply uncomfortable doing. Like I mean, I'm obviously not praying either, but while worship is going on, I can't even, I can't sing at all. That's definitely, it feels so untrue and untrue to myself because it feels like such a lie in some way.
Yes.
I don't know. So,
it's one thing to sit and listen to a sermon because you can sit and listen and be like, all right, I'm hearing you, but I don't really agree. Or here I'm thinking,
right.
But when you're singing, it's like you're agreeing to these statements.
Exactly.
I will never forget an experience I had in college. We were, I was the worship leader for this campus organization. So we were having our weekly large group meeting and, I had planned the service and planned the songs, but I didn't plan too well because our outreach coordinator had gotten up to do an announcement right before I went on to sing. And the announcement was about this event we were going to do that was fundraising for a child trafficking like ministry. And so they played this horrible video that was just the awfulness that is child trafficking, and it's just bleak, the worst thing. And then I get up to sing, and the song that I had to sing was, I don't remember the name of it, but the words were, "You make all things work together for my good."
Right.
I think that it's like, your love never fails. That's the name of the song by Jesus
Yes.
Culture. Your
Yeah.
love never fails,
Yes,
and
yeah.
I had to sing that into a mic. And
Yeah.
the whole time I'm singing, I'm just thinking, this is bullshit. This is bullshit. I can't. We just watched this video about children being trafficked, and I'm singing, "You stay the same through the ages. Your love never changes. There may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning." And I'm just like, oh,
Yeah.
it was awful. The mental gymnastics I had to do in my head to come up with some sort of prayer to bridge between that video and the song was horrible. And I just, man, yeah.
That might be the very song that made me like really,
It's rough.
Talk about like, Christians don't tell lies, they sing them. I
Mm-hmm.
remember this moment, a few months after deconversion for me, I'm in a church, and I think it was that song. And I'm thinking, really, it never failed.
You work all things together for whose good? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny because my response then was to go to these Reformed churches who would never sing a song like that, because they would say, "Oh, well, it's not theologically correct," and blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
So my response was to distance myself from that, to try and dig into, but it still didn't work.
Yes. Yeah. Sara, you had mentioned that you have a couple of questions about secular humanism.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm the best representative of that, but let's take a shot at that.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, I was kind of burnt out from my beliefs being my entire identity my whole life. So I've really just been enjoying not caring.
Yes.
Just being myself and whatever. But I'm really curious about secular humanism, because I think I'm realizing, as I'm getting to know myself apart from my faith, that I'm a deeply empathetic person.
Mhm.
My morality often, as I'm having to kind of figure out what my morality is, it centers around the flourishing of people doing, as much as possible. And so secular humanism seems really interesting to me. And I figure you're a captive audience because we're having this conversation. So I was like, I'll just ask David some things. So one of the things when I was a Christian that I would say I held on to, of like, why do you still believe in God? One of them was, well, when I look at human nature and the way that humans can be so amazing and loving and yet so evil also,
Yeah.
the only thing that made sense to me was the biblical explanation, which is that we're made in the image of God, but we've fallen to sin.
Yeah.
So from your perspective now as a materialist, atheist, what do you think, or like, how do you reconcile that when you look at humanity having these amazingly high heights of sacrifice and love, and then these horrible depths?
It's a great question, and it's one that will not be satisfying to the believers who are listening, but I'll talk about it a bit. Evolution is a part of this story, and recognizing and really admitting to oneself that we are an animal. We are, like we evolved, and part of that evolution is about survival. And so there is, definitely an element of selfishness that is a part of human nature, and that is from that survival instinct. It is, to make sure that I live. And the amazing thing is not that human beings are selfish. The amazing thing is that we can be altruistic, that the heights that you're describing. That's the amazing thing. We evolved to be social groups. We've been talking about the need for community. Yeah. And in fact, even just we're talking about music and the effect that it has on human beings is all part of that we need to feel connected with one another. And singing is an incredibly powerful way to do that. The thing that really I respond to when you mention that, your morality begins to be focused on human flourishing, that to me is the essence of humanism. Before, as a religious person, as a theist, you're handed your morality. And at some point you recognize that, well, that church over there, who also is Christian, and my church over here, we have disagreements, and yet we're supposed to have the same one true morality. And it is the recognition that human culture is going to differ, there's going to be similarities and differences, and trying to find what things are supracultural, above all cultures, about human flourishing, and building one's morality around that is really, in my mind, again, the essence of humanism. There's several books that I want to reference. You mentioned not wanting to read atheist books, and I get that.
Well, I'm not scared of them anymore, so I'd be open to it.
Yeah.
You know?
But I highly recommend 3 humanist books. One is Greg Epstein's Good Without God. And I call that like Humanism 101, right? So he does have at the beginning a little bit of, some arguments against theism, but primarily it's about our need to be ethical, our need to be in community and to do good for one another. Another is Sasha Sagan's For Small Creatures Such as We.
I have that on my shelf. I think I bought it because you talked about it on this.
Oh,
I haven't read
fantastic.
it yet, but yeah.
Yes, yeah, totally worth it. Her argument is about the need for ritual, that just because we've walked away from Christianity, well, not in her case, but like in my case, just because we've walked away from religious doesn't mean that we as human beings don't have deep needs for ritual. They don't have to be supernatural. They don't have to be binding, but we still need to be together in those important times. You talked about having the food train when you had your second child. When you lose a loved one, the birth of your child, what have you, all of those moments are really important, and we need each other. And then the third book is Catherine Osmond's Grace Without God, and very similar to the previous 2, but just being willing to say, whatever the term spiritual means, it is something we need. Whether, in my case, I'm saying it's purely natural and materialistic, but it is something that human beings need, something that we need to fulfill. And my entire argument, my entire point of the podcast, and what I talk about secular grace, is that we fulfill that for one another. That when we love each other, when you love your child and you're willing to do anything to express that love to him or her, when your husband shows ultimate grace and saying, I would just get another job, that's incredible. As well as the people that do show up and bring a casserole when you have, broken your leg, or you're having a child. Those are the things that we desperately need from one another. The point I want to make is the recognition that there's nothing supernatural going on there, that caring for one another for real life needs is grace, is the thing we've been searching for, right? And we can provide that for one another.
Yeah, I love that. And you made me think of something that has been a part of my journey. As a Christian, you're told don't have any idols before God, right? So anything can become an idol. I used to worry that I loved my husband too much and God was going to take him away somehow,
Right.
And then I've heard plenty of moms express a fear that their children have become an idol, that safety is an idol. And since I've, been kind of rebuilding post-faith, it's been amazing to give myself grace to be like, these are human things to want and need. And it's normal and good to want security. It's normal and good to love your children. And I've heard so many pastors, I recently had to go to my parents' church, and I heard a pastor talking about oh, well, if you build your life on anything but the gospel, if that thing gets taken away, you'll be devastated. And I'm like, yes, and what's your point? If my entire family died in a car crash, yes, I would be devastated. If I lost a child, I would be devastated. And so would you. You're lying. Yeah. If you say, pastor, that losing your wife or kid wouldn't devastate you. But the point is, I'm a human and I'll be able to hopefully rebuild. And, it's okay to need and have these needs for these things, because this is who we are. And to deny ourselves, to say that that's not true, is to one, heap shame upon yourself for wanting and needing normal things. And then 2, to be dishonest, to maybe not even accept grief. I know you've talked about the experience of grief post-faith. And yeah, I don't know. I just feel like secular humanism allows you to fully embrace being a human. And that has felt so much more freeing and open for growth, thinking about myself that way.
The other thing I want to express is just the spectrum of opportunities, right? We've talked about Rachel Held Elvin's, a progressive Christianity. We got lots of people that are in that bucket, or spiritual but not religious. Somewhat on the other end of that spectrum are I've got friends who have been on the podcast that talk about being religious but not spiritual. This is more of that need for ritual, but not the supernatural. And I find myself somewhere towards the religious but not spiritual. I still feel like I need ritual in my life, even though I reject supernatural elements. But I have lots and lots of people on who say, I need to believe in something,
Yeah.
and so, more power to them. That's fine. And so what is, I think, exciting about deconstruction and humanism is it is the discovery. You get to choose what works for you. You are an experiment of one, and you can try this and try that. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, you discard it and you move on. So if you listen to me very much at all, like I'm not a big meditation person, right? Like, but that's really important to lots and lots of people. And it's like, so what works for you is valuable, and go for it.
And isn't it delightful to be able to listen to people talk about their own beliefs and just feel curiosity?
Yes.
And not have to feel like anxiety about how I'm going to either
Right.
witness to them or refute their beliefs in my mind.
Exactly. Yeah. The same thing, here, when I started the podcast, I was either doing people who had fully deconverted or people who were very much Christian, and I was doing it not aggressively, but like, with kid gloves. And as the time has gone on, I've had much more of that spectrum of people in the in between, and I think that's really fascinating to find out how far they deconstruct, what they deconstruct, how they deconstruct, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, Sara, I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast. We'll say one more time your blog, formerprotagonist.blogspot.com. But thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Final thoughts on the episode. Well, as you could hear, Sara is a pretty amazing person, very talented, incredibly intelligent, and very articulate in the way that she describes her story. I love several of the things that she said, the way she described them. The concept of her blog, formerprotagonist.blogspot.com, is this idea of protagonist Christianity. She said that she felt like they were the protagonists. They had found the secret of life, and in comparison to those other people who were to be pitied or feared. I thought that was really well stated. I love the way she talked about her belief as a child. The sky is blue and God is real. Like, that just conveyed it so well. She was a part of a Assemblies of God charismatic environment, and everything felt real and vibrant to her. And then she talked about doubt like a disease, that it would go into remission for some time and then come back with force. Those are just really incredible ways of describing things. And as I have mentioned now multiple times, Sara has written quite eloquently about her deconversion and other topics on her blog. Please check it out, formerprotagonist.blogspot.com. I want to thank Sara for being on the podcast and for sharing with such honesty and passion about the process of deconversion that she went through. I also want to thank her for asking about secular humanism. I like to point out that I'm not trying to be a humanist apologist, but I do like to convey to people that this is an option. And the exciting thing is that you get to decide for yourself. You get to find out what works for you. But I absolutely love talking about that, so thank you for asking those questions as well, Sara. Thank you for being on the show. The Secular Grace thought of the week, I can't help but respond to Sara talking about no longer singing. I felt like that was the darkest moment of the interview, and it shouldn't have been. But I felt Sara's loss and grief at that. And as I've talked about before many times, the church provides a place for regular people to exercise their talents or the things that they just want to do. Sara talked deeply about being needed and feeling useful, and then being at a larger church where she didn't feel as needed. I am still obsessed with how can we carry that over into the secular world? How can you, the listener, exercise your talents in some other forum than church? So I'm putting this out to you again. If you know of a way that you could participate with the podcast, that could be music, that could be PR, that could be community development, community leadership. anything that you feel like you could add to the podcast, I want to hear about it. I want to see if there's a way that I can help you do that. I know for me, the amount of bandwidth that I have is just enough to do the podcast. And I am deeply concerned about creating more secular community, but I just know I'm not capable of doing that on my own. I don't have the bandwidth for it. So if that is something that you're interested in, please get in touch with me and let's make that happen. If you are a musician and you want your piece of music to be played, if there's no licensing problems, I'll probably play it on the podcast. Get in touch with me. I'll mention here a few ways that people are participating already. Obviously, Mike T is editing the podcasts and has been doing an amazing job. As you can hear from today's episode, how much better it is than the last couple of ones that I edited. Jimmy and Colin and I have chatted on a number of occasions, and the next episode is out of those conversations. Jimmy and I are going to do a book review of Julia Galef's Scout Mindset. We're also looking to potentially doing a movie review where we want to think of movies that specifically have secular grace under the hood. Obviously, it wouldn't be in those terms, but things that we can draw out of that. So that'll be coming up in the future as well. And then the thing that I'll be revealing here in the next week or two is Logan Thomas, also known as Beyond Belief online, has redesigned the logo for the podcast for me. And I'm really excited. That'll be coming out here shortly. So those are just some examples of ways that you can participate. If you can think of something that you want to do, get in touch with me, gracefulatheist@gmail.com. Until next week, my name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist. You can Google Deconversion. You can Google Secular Grace. You can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.